Hey everybody, how you doing? Tom Barnes here. Stories from the 78. Chicago, a city of music. Any neighborhood, any given day, you can find live music. In the summertime, just drive down one of the streets. Music coming out of bars, apartments, houses, venues, Wrigley Field. And I'm not talking about in between innings with the Cubs because there's concerts there. There is a place in Chicago, among many others, but this particular one, the Old Town School of Music, that is just like this flagpole planted in the earth of music for an entire area of the country. And the Old Town does that. Chicago does that. They have an amazing event happening this week, Thursday, April 16th, where they are celebrating the life of Justin Townes Earle. Jonathan Bernstein's coming in to do a talk of several people. I want to get into it. I don't want to step on his toes right now. Jonathan, how you doing, man?
I'm doing great, Tom. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to chat.
Of course, I mean, it doesn't happen often where I get to talk to somebody who's worked at some prestigious magazines like yourself. Why don't you run down the list of some of your accolades? I don't want to step on your toes here.
Sure. I'm currently the senior research editor at Rolling Stone, which is basically a fancy way of saying fact checker. So I'm a fact checker at Rolling Stone. I also do a lot of writing for them. And back when I was a freelancer, I freelanced at Oxford American, The Guardian, GQ, a few other places.
But Rolling Stone's got to be fun, huh? Among other things, but Rolling Stone's Rolling Stone, right?
It's a lot of fun. I feel very lucky to get to work with such amazing colleagues and get to think about music and art all day.
And speaking of, there's a great event here in Chicago on Thursday, April 16th, I should say, at the Old Town School of Music. Why don't you tell folks about this? Because unfortunately, we're talking about something that's, something tragic that happened, but we're celebrating a life.
Yes. So I'm going to be just one of several people taking part in a really special event at the Old Town on Thursday evening. The event is all about celebrating the life and music of Justin Townes Earle. And so we have a couple different musicians and writers coming in with different perspectives, and all of whom had different relationships and connections to Justin and his work. So the night is basically going to start off with a conversation between me and Rob Miller. So I'm there because I've spent the last 3 years of my life writing the biography of Justin Townes Earle, which just came out in January.
I buried the lead. I'm sorry.
Of course, no. It's called "What Do You Do When You're Lonesome?" And I spoke with several hundred people who knew Justin to try to form a portrait of Justin's life. And so I'll obviously be talking not only about Justin, but specifically his ties to Chicago and his time at the Old Town. Justin spent time there, which we can get into, but I will be talking with Rob Miller, who is the co-founder of Bloodshot Records, a Chicago institution, signed Justin Townes Earle to his first, and I think most would say most important record deal of his career. Justin released his first 4 records on Bloodshot.
Yeah.
And Rob wrote a beautiful memoir about his time as the head of Bloodshot and his time in Chicago and his time with Justin that came out just in the fall. So Rob and I are going to be having a talk about Justin, like I said, Bloodshot, Chicago, his roots, all of it, the Old Town. And then after us, we're basically just the opening act because we're just talking, right? The main event really is a singer-songwriter named Sammy Brew, who is a wonderful singer-songwriter, folk singer, who was mentored by Justin when he was just a little kid, actually. Had a really close relationship with Justin. Sammy is photographed on the cover of the Single Mothers album. That's Sammy Brew as like a 13-year-old kid. And Sammy came out. There are a lot of reasons Sammy's going to be there, but the main reason is that just a few months ago in January, Sammy came out with a record called The Journals, which is the product of Sammy spending several years looking through Justin Townes Earle's unfinished lyrics and kind of picking up some of those songs. Some of them were more finished than others, and sort of basically setting them to music, and in some cases even finishing the lyrics himself. And so he has a whole record that is this beautiful musical tribute to Justin. And the last person that I must mention who is going to be a really special part of the musical portion is a woman named October Cravasi, who was in a band with Justin at the Old Town in 2000. They were in a band together called Lubbock. Justin sang a few of his songs in that band when he was an 18-year-old kid, basically, before he had a record deal. And
Wow.
October and Sammy are gonna sing a version of one of those songs that she used to duet with Justin on when he was 18 years old. So she really kind of, in many ways, I think, brings the whole event full circle because she met Justin at the Old Town. So that's a
Wow.
a long description of what I hope will be a really beautiful night for his fans.
It does sound like a beautiful night, and there's a lot of people in there that have done incredible things besides Justin. I know we're there to celebrate
Yes.
his life, but you just went down the list of people, Sammy specifically, about finding old lyrics and putting words to lyrics and songs to lyrics. No pressure, right? Like
Yeah.
that is a daunting task. I've heard of authors do that with I interviewed a gentleman who wrote some of Romero's old works. He finished them and made them his own, and they co-wrote it, and it was great. But I can't imagine just music is different. I guess not different, but it's just a different medium to tell stories. But man, oh man, no pressure.
Yeah, really daunting task. It makes me think of the great Woody Guthrie inspired Wilco Billy Bragg albums, Mermaid Avenue from however many decades ago. It's really hard to do that thing where you are both honoring the original artist but also saying something with your own voice, and I think Sammy found a way to do that. So he'll be singing those songs from his
Mhm.
new record, and also some Justin Townes Earle songs that we all know and love. Famous, more well-known Justin songs. So his set should be a really wonderful tribute to Justin.
So you mentioned he was at Bloodshot in 2000. So that's a minute ago, right? I mean, that's 26 years ago. A lot of history before that, and after it, obviously. But for folks who don't know much about Justin Townes Earle, if you could just give us a little drive by of his career, which is unfair to do in an interview like this because you wrote an entire book about it. But if you could.
Of course, yeah. So Justin Townes Earle is a very, I would say, incredibly formative and important singer-songwriter in the music that we now call Americana. From
Mhm.
everyone from Charlie Crockett to Sierra Farrell, both of whom covered Justin songs, to people like Tyler Childers and Zach Bryan, folks who sell out stadiums today. I think a lot of them can either directly or indirectly trace their lineage back to Justin Townes Earle, who is the son of Steve Earle, a
Mhm.
famous country singer. His middle name is named after Towns Van Zandt. Um, and Justin was born in Nashville. He had a difficult childhood, a difficult upbringing. He had a famous father who struggled
Mhm.
with addiction. He himself was kind of left on his own in many ways as a kid and had a hard time in school, dropped out of school by the time he was in ninth grade, and started writing beautiful songs as a teenager, started living a very tough, difficult, intense life as a teenager, fell prey to addiction struggles really early on in his life, but sort of came out the other end and became a sober man in his 20s and started, that's when he signed to Bloodshot Records
Mhm.
in 2007. Um, and started releasing these amazing records in the late 2000s and early 2010s that really kind of shaped a lot of music at that time. It was kind of part of that moment when Mumford and Sons, groups like that, were really taking off. This sort of post Great Recession moment in American history when a lot of sort of more traditional and acoustic based folk music was finding this unlikely almost kind of popularity, and Justin was right at the center of it. His biggest record was Harlem River Blues, which people might know. That's probably his most well known song. And he was really destined, I think, for a certain type of stardom that, for a number of reasons, which I get into in the book, never quite came. But he continued to release beautiful records throughout the 2010s and had a really devoted following. He wrote incredible songs that really connected to, that were very vulnerable and very open and very, that people had a really strong connection to because he was really forthcoming about his struggles. And yeah, his path took him, the very first place Justin ever really lived, apart from the Nashville area, was Chicago, when he went to the Old Town school as an 18-year-old because his father, Steve Earle, was teaching a class at the Old Town.
I think
in the winter of
not to interrupt you, I think I booked Steve. I used to work for WGN back in the day, and he like I booked him on WGN to play a show because of a show with the Old Town School. Like
Wow.
that's so it's kind of like it's all popping in my brain now. And I think I misspoke. I think he said he was on Bloodshot in 2000. I think I misspoke because you
Oh
it,
yes, right. That was Old Town in the 2000,
thank you.
Bloodshot
Sorry.
a few years later. Yeah, that's okay. He has a lot. Justin, Chicago was sort of a home away from home for Justin in a lot of ways because he had these various connections to the city. But yeah, that's my very crass attempt at trying to sum up his life and his career in one answer.
Well, what would you say? What the years of being in Chicago? What like the city of Chicago and the music scene here? What did it do for him in his career? For Justin's career?
So yeah, so I mean, Justin spends about 6 months in Chicago again as an 18-year-old. I like to in my book I refer to it almost as like a study abroad kind of moment for him. You know, it's kind of the first time where he is able to really sort of test his skills as a budding singer songwriter to a new audience. He finally has folks who don't know that much about him, don't know where he comes from, only maybe know who his father is. And so he kind of, you know, Justin had a community of artists already at that point in Nashville, but when he comes to Chicago and specifically kind of situates himself in the Old Town community, he meets all these older musicians, music teachers, people in bands, and really, I think took in so much influence from them. He hung out with the Chicago band at the time called Old Number Six, um, and started playing gigs at all sorts of places. But I also really think it was very important for him to be able to sort of show off and display what he had learned at that point as a musician and as a guitar player and as a songwriter, and also what he had not yet learned. And kind of, it was a really important sort of almost, I would say, training ground musically and artistically for him. Sort of, yeah, the first place that he was able to sort of leave the Nashville bubble, so to speak, and see
Mm-hmm.
how his art resonated or didn't resonate with people who didn't know who he was.
You know, it's funny that you say that. What he did in his time here, you know, meeting people that were teachers, that were in bands, or you know, all this stuff. I feel like nationally, Chicago has a reputation for not being that. You know, like there's a huge musical engine in this city, all over the city, from the South Shore. I mean, Kanye's from like the South Shore, right? All the way, you know, all over the place. There's all these pockets where there's music or there's jazz or there's blues, like on the South Side. You know, it's and like it's crazy to me. You know, so much of what's talked about as far as music in our country, you don't hear that part too much of like where these bands are cutting their teeth outside of like what you hear in Nashville. And then you know, hear about bands on the club circuit that are, you know, riding high and getting, you know, LA and, you know, New York, and you hear Chicago. It's just, it's not, it's refreshing to hear somebody actually know and acknowledge like the music scene in Chicago. Cause I mean, in my intro, I said that, you know, any given day in this city, you can find live music, you know, it's everywhere. And it's for bands that are trying to regroup and figure out who they are as bands. I like major bands that will come here and play under different names, and I'm sure they do it all over the place. But you know, we're in the middle of the country; we don't get a lot of love, so it's nice to hear, is what I'm saying.
Definitely, and I think Rob Miller and his book is called "The Hours Are Long and the Pay Is Low." Um, Rob, who of course was someone who got to witness this as a record, as the head of a small label based in Chicago, and also has such a great ear for signing so many amazing artists all across the country, not only in Chicago. So I think Rob has an amazing perspective on exactly what you were just saying. But yeah, Justin, he had this great. The first time he played the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville, he has a great. He tells the crowd, "I had to go to Chicago, Illinois, in order to in order to make a country, an old fashioned country record." And I think Justin, and Rob Miller, of course, are just two tiny little temples in uh, only a small sliver of what you were just describing in the city's music scene, which is just the rich, rich history of country roots music in Chicago, which is
Yeah,
not even the first or second genre the city is, of course, known for.
yeah, it's. I mean, country music is huge here. People don't realize. I mean, I worked in radio for a number of years, and like Chicago was the biggest country market because it
Wow.
was so like the country radio station, like back in the day, it was like US 99, and they were the country station, bigger than the ones in Nashville, and I think at the time there wasn't even a country station in New York or LA.
Right.
So by default, Chicago was just it because we were, the third largest city, right? But you have like Windy City Smokeout, that is an entire like thing that came out of nowhere, out of a parking lot in like some sad bastard building in the back, to now this giant thing by the United Center, where it's a couple multiple days celebrating country music. And then have you heard of Carol's Pub by chance in any of your writings over the years?
No, no, I don't think I have actually.
Carol's Pub is like a legendary honky tonk country bar in Chicago. Stays up open till like 5 a.m.
Whoa.
And that's where people would go, man. You wanted to hear like live country music at 3 o'clock in the morning on a Friday or Saturday night. You went to Carol's Pub. Still there, still doing their thing. They've, changed owners, but they're relatively untouched in the same. So it's very I don't know. It's pleasing to hear somebody talk about the country scene just because it doesn't get talked about. Like you said, it's not
Yeah.
like the one or two here.
Wow. Well, I'll have to check out Carol's Pub myself. But yeah, the first year that Justin released his first album, The Good Life, which was on Bloodshot Records, he played and I don't remember the name of it. It might have been an early version of what became Windy City Smokeout, but he played an enormous country music festival in Chicago where he was actually on the same bill as a very young Taylor Swift in 2008, uh, which
Ooh,
is kind of
really?
crazy to imagine. And I'm blanking on the name, but it was in September of 2008, and it might have been just an earlier version of that
It
festival.
it could have been. I mean, there's only other thing I can really think of
I know it was
something
out by
called
Soldier Field or something.
Soldier Field.
There's
I
some
mean, it
park
just
out by there.
yeah. I mean, it could have just been like a one-off concert thing, but they
Yeah.
had like Country Thunder, but that was like up in like Wisconsin.
Mm,
Um, but yeah, I don't remember. Like, but it was a very. I'm trying to remember the first location of it, but it was not where it is now.
got it.
But it was in the city proper, like in just ran like in River North, I think it was, not far from Soldier Field.
Hmm.
Anyhow, we digress. But either way, that's what this city does for artists, all artists, but country is like the thing. It's like Chicago's jam. We push them out. So it's interesting to hear about Justin's career here. I read something that he wrote about going back to like kind of who he was as a person, is
Yeah.
that he fell for it. He fell for the you have to make yourself suffer to then create great art. He's like, I fell for it. And would you say that that kind of sums up like the way that he looked at himself as an artist? And then of course he realized afterwards he didn't have to do that, and he was on the other side of things when he was talking about that. Make sure I get that the proper context. But what do
Yeah.
you
Yeah, so you're touching on something that is basically forms the entire introduction of my book and how I decided to sort of enter the story, have introduce readers to the story and in some ways the legend of Justin Townes Earle, which is through this concept of what he called the myth, which is
Mhm.
this idea that you were just pointing to of that I think a lot of people subscribe to in society or that we are exposed to a lot in the worlds of art, which is like you know um, suffering or pain or living a crazy rock and roll lifestyle can lead to great art. And Justin grew up believing that
Hmm.
in very many ways. He then very much later in his career and once he got sober grew to view that as a very harmful sort of bad way of incorrect way of viewing creativity and songwriting. But I would say that his relationship to this concept of the myth is I think one of the sort of central inner artistic and sort of philosophical conflicts of his life. He was
Yeah.
very ambivalent about it. He went back and forth about it, unfortunately, as his life progressed and as his career progressed and as he unfortunately relapsed later in his life. So it was something that I think in his best moments he really believed like we don't we don't all have to think this way. Art does not have to be. You can create art from a healthy place. You can live a positive life, um, and still write a great song. But there were parts of him that continued to believe sort of elements of the myth. I think throughout his whole career, and it was a real conflict.
Yeah, I imagine, and he's not the first one to say it, and he certainly won't be the last as far as, bands or artists just creating art in general, right? People have for years and years and years thought that. I feel like the 80s and 90s really sent that on a rocket ship into the stratosphere as
Yeah.
far as, all of those the bands and even hip hop and everything else, so it's tragic to see somebody struggle with that so much because I mean, as a tale of rock and roll in this country, specifically, there's so many bands that have been taken before perhaps they should have because of things like that.
Justin's hero, as like many 12-year-olds' heroes in 1994, was Kurt Cobain. That was that was his generational icon, and he was, as a kid, like many of us are, he was given so many examples of these things. He compared himself when Amy Winehouse died. Justin compared himself
Ugh,
to Amy, and he talked about how devastating it was as someone who had struggled himself with addiction when addiction takes one of us, as he put it.
yeah.
So Justin, he was keenly aware of the cost, the social cost, the human cost of this way of thinking had on artists, and how the world and our country treats artists and kind of almost expects them to live this certain kind of way, and then in some way glamorizes them when they do die early. And I really wanted, with my book at least, I really wanted to try to find a way to tell his story in an honest way that did not, that made clear the cost of this thing and did not paint a rosy picture, but at the same time truly celebrate his life as an artist, which is what I hope the Old Town event is. It will be really focused around his music in that way.
And speaking of his music, you mentioned that his lyrics, vulnerable and so deep with, who he was as a person. And you mentioned all these other artists that have used some of his works as inspiration, like, Zach Brown or whomever, right? Do you think that that is why the you said it earlier, and that's it's been sticking with my brain since you said
Mhm.
it, the emerging, I don't know if it's emerging or it's just becoming more mainstream, that Americana sound that like, I think just yesterday I was watching NBC for their baseball, and I think Zach Brown is the voice of like Sunday Night Baseball on NBC,
Mm.
which you also have, which is a huge nod for them. But I mean, you're seeing that being recognized on a more national level with like bands like Mumford and Sons, or even like, the Lumineers, if you will. You know what
Yes.
I mean? Like
Yes.
it's becoming bigger and bigger. And is it just, what do you think that is? Is that just a starvation for like actual lyrics from a human being these days versus garbage that is AI created?
I think that for lack of a better phrase, acoustic forward music in this country in the 21st century has gone through periods every few years of having, like, of just resurging and being commercially popular. We had
Yeah.
the century started with "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou," right, which sold 7 million records.
Yeah.
10 years later, you have the first wave of Mumford and Sons and the Avett Brothers and Lumineers. That's when Justin found his footing as an artist. And now we're kind of in another post, we're in like a neo Mumford moment of those bands' resurgence. Those bands are back. The Lumineers are playing stadiums and are as popular as they've ever
Stadiums.
been. And you have a whole new crop of artists who are influenced by folks like Mumford, the Lumineers. I would add Justin. And those artists, which range from Noah Kahan, who's playing stadiums, to
I was just
Zach
about to say.
Bryan, who's playing stadiums, to someone like Miles Smith in England, to Shabuzi. All of these artists are um, making a very sort of, folk clap, very sort of acoustic influenced music. To Tyler Childers, who's doing it from more of a pure country perspective, but is
Yeah.
playing stadiums. They're appealing to teenagers, and it's a really interesting moment. I think you could probably make a lot of social and political, cases and economic cases to why this music is back. In 2010, it was back in, like I said, in after the years after the Great Recession, which I don't think was unrelated, and I don't think this moment is unrelated to the larger socio-political moment we're living in either. But yeah, it's really interesting how it just comes back, and then it'll probably go away again, and then it'll probably come back in another 9 years.
Yeah,
Um,
I've had this argument with people throughout, since probably the mid 2000s about, you know, music in general and how much it's changed and how much, the AI or just electronic has affected like typical folk music or Americana music or even just rock and roll music, like what people quote unquote rock and roll, like rock bands. They're just not out there as much as they were, pre 2000, right? You had all these bands that were rolling through the 90s, and then they kind of went away, and hip hop took off and pop music took off, and K-pop was a thing for such a long time. I guess it still is. If you're a fan, they're still everywhere doing their thing. But if you were just we've been talking a lot of different things here, and I'll get
Yeah.
back to the end of why we're talking. But since I was talking to a music expert, what's your take on just music right now, as far as people who love, Americana music or country music or rock and roll music? What's where are we going with this music?
Wow. I do think that it's kind of everything is in cycles. I think that you're right. And, the other piece of the puzzle with this acoustic based music right now is the enormous, overwhelming sort of cultural moment that country music and music emanating from Nashville is having and has been having for the past few years, from Beyonce to Post Malone to Lana Del Rey. All of these artists from across genres kind of flocking to that imagery and that aesthetic and that sound. And I think that yeah, there has been a slight recession in some ways in the past few years, a slight receding uh, of the cultural dominance of hip hop and electronic music to that stuff. And I would be sort of surprised if it didn't bounce back, in the next few years, just because that seems to be the evidence of how things have gone. Even within country music itself, like even the genres themselves kind of have this push pull thing where country will have a few years of being a little more traditional, a little more Chris Stapleton, and then
Yeah.
it'll bounce towards a little more Morgan Wallen, a little more hip hop influence, a little more drum programming, and now so like I think each individual genre has that happening, and then up top, when you take all the genres and just contemporary popular music in general, there's that sort of push pull dynamic. So I guess if I had to like place a bet, I would guess that in 5 years there would be, a lot more sort of like, yeah, electronic oriented and influenced like cultural dominance musically than there is right now, because I can't imagine country maintaining the type of commercial popularity that it's had. I mean, Ella Langley's "Choosing Texas" is the most popular song in the country for the past 6 weeks, which shocks me to no end. You know,
There's a few times where I'm pretty shocked at what's the number one song in the United States.
yeah.
So I mean, what do I know, right? But either way, a lot of these artists we talked about influenced by Justin Townes Earle, and that's why we're talking about this celebration at the Old Town School of Music, Thursday, April 16th. Jonathan, you're going to be there. Run again really quickly. Who's going to
Yes.
be there, and what time things start, and where? If you remember, I can tell you. If you don't, but if where they can get tickets.
Absolutely. So we're gonna kick off at 7 p.m. Just making sure I got that right. And it's gonna be me and Rob Miller. Both of us have different books that we just put out. That kind of the Venn diagram overlap is Justin Townes Earle. Rob
Mm-hmm.
signed Justin to his first label. I just wrote a biography of Justin. We're gonna be talking about Justin, Chicago, the Old Town, Bloodshot, and then following that conversation will be a really special musical performance and musical tribute to Justin, helmed by Sammy Brew, who has a new record coming out, or who has a new record that's recently out, that pays tribute to Justin, and it'll feature very special guest October Cravasi, who's used to duet with Justin himself in Chicago
Wow.
26 years ago. And tickets are available at Old Town's website. It's listed as a class, not a concert. So if you go to Old Town's website and you want to find out more about the show, honestly, I would just Google Old Town School of Folk Music, Justin Townes Earle. But
And I'll
if
link it on here.
yeah, go. It's listed under the classes. It's technically a workshop. But that's probably the easiest way to find it. I've also been posting about it on all my social media, so you can probably find it that way too.
And to purchase your book, What to Do When You're Lonesome, where can people buy that?
People, you can buy "What Do You Do When You're Lonesome," biography of Justin Townes Earle, at your local bookshop. You can look it up on yeah, it's sold wherever books are sold. So
Got it. Got it.
Google it, or go to your best bet is to go to your bookstore and request it if they don't have it.
Amen to that. And people
Yeah.
can find you and follow you with your work with Rolling Stone at where?
I am at my website is johnbernsteinwriting.com. That's John with no H, JONBERNSTEIN writing.com is probably the best way. And the last thing I should remember to mention is that the bookseller in Chicago, wonderful bookstore, will be on site selling both Rob's book and my own for anyone who's interested.
That remember we talked about earlier, that is so Chicago. So well done, Jonathan Bernstein. Thank you so much for taking time to chat with me about this amazing event happening here in Chicago on Thursday, April 16th.